But right now we're very lucky to have Armstrong Yakubu with us, who's the architect, an architect with Foster and Partners, and he's going to talk a little about architecture and its place in the environment. So I hand over to you, Armstrong.
Thank you. Yes, it was Tom's idea to do this. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Yep.
Then let's just see, share screen. That one. You can see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. And then we'll start play. So just as a brief overview, the things that are driving us as architects right now, obviously, are, number one, obviously, is the Paris Accord, COP21 2015, which the UK is a signatory of. And the idea is to reduce, temperatures within a certain period of time. So that is something that, as architects, we've taken very seriously, because the built environment, our buildings actually have quite an impact on global warming and also quite an impact on greenhouse gases as well. So the need for us, especially as developed countries, to create buildings, especially new buildings, has an impact. So as we move forward, we should be very cognizant about how we do that. But also coupled with that, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well. And when you look at all 17 of these goals, they kind of take on board quite simple, basic elements, but each one of those elements, if taken very seriously, do point towards a more equitable, greener future for all of us. And you can see that many of these, in these 17 goals here, architecture, and actually where we are, education comes in quite a bit as well. And that's where we collide. So architects, quality education, providing schools, sustainable cities and communities, and it's even been taken further. This just shows you the 17, and what's been added into this 17 is also disability. So each of these now has disability as well built into every single one of these as well. So it's become something that is quite holistic in how we move forward. And I think it's important as architects and as just human beings really to take on board each of these 17 points and really think seriously about them. As an architect, for example, for every line I draw, am I really considering all of these elements that you see here? And then just taking one step further, this is the donut economics diagram by Kate Raworth, where she talks about that safe and just space for humanity. And it applies to all of us, obviously, and applies to economists as well. But as architects, do our buildings contributing and making sure that we're within that safe and just place? We're not, and we can do this very much with buildings. Are we overshooting, climate change, air pollution, biodiversity loss, which buildings do, land conversion? So are we pushing those boundaries? And then there are the other things, which is the social foundation, which we're also involved with in education, health, where we have to create buildings for as well. So are we able to, in our role as architects, and as able to make sure that we're responsible when we're thinking about the parts that we deal with that actually impact on all of these. And kind of takes us back to Capital Academy as well. So there is obviously embodied carbon, which is basically the carbon which it takes to make a building, material extraction, manufacturing. And that is something which is actually quite serious, because it is what we're trying to limit. So we know that buildings are basically carbon hungry, so that they take. And then there is the operational, which is how the buildings are run over time, and how they use energy, and what kind of carbon effect that has as well. And in many cases, buildings can have a lifespan of 50 years, 100 years. And we're thinking now as architects that it should last even much longer, so that the carbon footprint is not a huge penalty. So the longer a building exists, the more likely it is to have a better carbon footprint, as opposed to a building that has a very short life and is demolished. and all that carbon is lost in seconds. So I think it's something that we have to think very carefully about. So the longer buildings can adapt and change, I'm talking about, and like now we're thinking about bringing photovoltaics onto Capital Academy. The building can progress and keep in tune with future demands. And then on top of this, the idea about circularity, the fact that things can there's a circle, you're a bit like the donut economics, you can come back. So everything has a cycle and moves around in the cycle like solar energy does. And really thinking very hard about what that means in terms of the energy of how the buildings is used, and taking it further now as architects. We now look very carefully at the manufacturing process, where it's located, what kind of power is it getting. Really trying very hard to make sure that as we jump in and create buildings, we're really, really careful that we are not in any way, I mean, we are obviously, but we are trying to minimize the impact that our buildings can have. And actually, currently we're thinking it's perhaps better to not to try and reuse more buildings than it is to build brand new ones. So it's changing very rapidly, but that's because of the very, very slide, which is the Paris Accord, which is we really have to do something. Otherwise, it's kind of, it's pretty desperate. So something has to give. And I just put this in just so that it's a kind of a layman's or layperson's idea. When you look at the energy carbon that is in buildings, you suddenly see it makes a lot of sense. So you look at a concrete building, for example, and you can see how much carbon it's creating. And you can look at different materials. And as you begin to think about the materials one uses in buildings, now we have means of measuring what the embodied carbon is. So we're now a lot more careful about how we choose the materials we use, or be aware of them and use them in a more precious manner, as opposed to using them without concerns about carbon, the environment, and all that comes with it. So you can see here that, if I just look at the exterior buildings, brick, for example, is much worse than steel, and steel is a lot worse than timber. And timber is now seen as very much a very environment benign, so a much more better way of building buildings. But if you're to use brick, then we should be very careful about knowing that brick has a heavy demand in terms of carbon. I mean, quite close to concrete. And many of us probably live in brick buildings, but those brick buildings are quite old, so the carbon is long, and so that's not the impact. But brand new buildings, obviously, there is an impact. And taking it all down to the internal finishes as well. So it's things like that we think about. And it boils down to a very simple sentence, which is actually in the UN Sustainable Goals agenda, which is do the most with least. I think that is something that we all should strive for, and as architects, we strive for that as well. And I thought I'll just give an example of a building that is it's the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts. It's in Norwich, and it's one of my favorite Foster and Partners buildings. It's 40 years old, so it's kind of old. But what it does, though, is it takes all those principles. And I suppose what I was trying to say is that the longer the buildings last and are able to adapt, the better they are in terms of carbon, the better they are in terms of environment. So how do you design a building that anticipates the changes that are coming in the future? Do our buildings become dinosaurs very quickly and get removed with all the carbon that it took to put them up? Or can they continue to exist far longer than we hope they could? And I think taking those principles that I spoke about earlier on, I think it's important that as architects, we think about them very seriously. And I think the proof is that if you do take those things very seriously, the buildings will stand the test of time and be able to change and adapt moving into the future. So this building, which is this is a very early sketch done 40 years ago by Norman Foster, is for an art gallery in a university, done in a very lightweight industrial style. And you can see it treats the materials as very precious, it's very lightweight. So the weight and cost of a building is directly proportional to the carbon that it uses. So the cheaper the building is and the lighter it is, the chances are that it has fantastic embodied carbon credentials. Capital Academy was built with also on a budget. Those buildings are done with not a lot of money. And I think you will find that if it's measured in any way I'm going to try and look at that actually. I'm going to talk to I've already started having discussions about it. I have a feeling that it's also quite good in terms of its embodied carbon. And begin to look at, and this building basically takes out all the decoration that you might have. So you can see the air conditioning and the plant is all not enclosed. So it really is trying to use the least amount of material as possible to create a space which is completely accessible, open for all. Yes, it displays art, so it's got a certain sort of kudos about it, but nevertheless, it does it in a setting which is completely different from what I understood when I saw this building as a young person before I was an architect, thinking, here's a building that doesn't look like a museum that I know. So it was accessible to me as a young Black person who wanted to go into architecture, saying, here is a building that wasn't pompous like what I was used to. It was totally accessible. It was in a campus which had lots of students. So the students came from all over the world. It was a place I felt quite safe to be. It was one of the buildings that actually made me convince me that I could be an architect. And this is, and 40 years on, going back, I was there, it was COVID, and I just realized just how accessible it was. So here is going back to the UN Sustainable Goals, here with disability built into it. Here was the staircase that took you to the galleries below, but it's just an equally enjoyable way of the couple here on the right going down this platform that took them down as well. There was no need for a sign here that told one that one had a handicap or disabled people, or one was for able-bodied people. Just by visual representation, the building, and you can see the outside there are no steps. So the building is completely accessible. It's lightweight. It's still around today. It's changing every time. It's been refurbished, but it hasn't been demolished. So the building has got probably another 50 years to go very comfortably. And that really builds into this idea that as architects, we think about all of these things as buildings that are going to last for a very, very long time, so that the carbon is captured at make, but not totally lost with demolition and redundancy. And that's it, really. That was just a very short sort of introduction, just to give you an overview, which builds very nicely into what I'm going to pass it back to Tom, I think, and we can discuss further. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Armstrong. That was really interesting, and it reminds us that there is, these questions are central to all our thinking now, and sort of moving on to what Brent